Hello, welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Allison Gampel, Associate Director of Alumni Programs at York University. Thank you so much for joining us today for how ecological footprint accounting can inform pathways to a carbon neutral economy. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub speaker series and features timely and relevant educational lectures by academics and researchers from York. Today's Scholars Hub is in partnership with our Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. I want to begin by acknowledging the land York's campuses are built on. As this event is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake region. I am grateful for the opportunity to live and work on Treaty 13 land. Before we introduce our speakers today, I would also like to invite you to join us at the York U of the Future alumni event on April 30th, where our president, Rhonda Lenton, will be joined by student, faculty, and alumni panelists to discuss the opportunities, challenges, and priorities for the university in 2021 and beyond, and to answer questions from our alumni and friends. For more information about this, please visit yorku.ca/alumni and friends/future. Let's get started. We do like to get to know our audience a bit better with a quick poll before each lecture. Today's question is, how would you rate your current knowledge on today's topic? You'll see that the poll has popped up, so if you can take a moment just to respond to that, that would be wonderful. Great. Thank you everyone for participating. It's very helpful for us and our speakers to have an idea about who's in our audience and the knowledge that you each have with regards to the topic that we're discussing. If you need help at all today with the Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. We have a team who's ready to help you. That same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speakers to answer during the Q&A period following today's presentation. And for those of you watching live on Facebook, feel free to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for the video, and the team will send them my way. To begin today's event, I'd like to welcome Alice Havorka, Dean of the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, to give some updates from the faculty and to introduce today's guest speaker. Dean Havorka, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Allison, and good afternoon to everyone that has joined us here today and that will be watching this recording after the fact. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to let you know and remind those of you that already know that 8 months ago on September 1st, we launched York University's new Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. This has brought together students, staff, faculty, donors, community partners, and 12,000 alumni from our legacy Department of Geography and our legacy Faculty of Environmental Studies. We have come together around a mission which is to mobilize knowledge for a just and sustainable future. And today's feature event focuses on the Ecological Footprint Initiative, which is a prime example on how York's new EUC is striving to make positive change. I don't need to remind you that we are amidst an environmental crisis, and we are in this crisis trying to carve a path forward. Whether it's climate change or the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're seeing on the horizon is a need to put ourselves on a path of green recovery. This necessarily green recovery means that we can't just simply look to economic growth as an indicator of success, but we also need to look at how this growth is impacting the environment. So we need to use tools like the ecological footprint to inform decisions on behalf of people and the planet. EUC's Ecological Footprint Initiative is something that we're very proud of. It serves as a living lab where we're producing the national footprints accounts for countries around the world. It's also a living lab where our students can get real world experience and gain skills for their career paths through courses that we offer and research that offers them exposure to big data sets and biocapacity accounting. It is also a home base for our two guest speakers today, and I'd like to introduce them now. Mr. Eric Miller is an alumni. He graduated from the Masters of Environmental Studies program in 2005. Eric is an economist and educator with interests in sustainability metrics and models and policy. He teaches graduate courses in ecological economics and sustainability informatics at our faculty. And he directs, of course, our Ecological Footprint Initiative, which delivers various projects, including the production of the National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity accounts. Welcome to Eric. And I'll also introduce his co-presenter, Dr. Katie Kish, who is an alumni. She earned her Bachelor's of Environmental Studies in 2011, followed by a Master's of Environmental Studies in 2013. Katie is a research associate for the Ecological Footprint Initiative. She supports knowledge synthesis and mobilization of the team's research. Katie has a background in complex systems thinking and ecological economics, which she applies to research on production, labor, and open knowledge commons. She is also a lecturer of ecological economics at the Haida Gwaii Institute and a research fellow with the Economics for the Anthropocene. Welcome to Katie. You already know from Allison's introduction that today's talk is entitled How Ecological Footprint Accounting Can Inform Pathways to a Carbon Neutral Economy. I'll ask Eric and Katie to share their screens and come forward for their presentation, and we will see you again at the question and answer period. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Great to be presenting to you today. So Katie and I are going to speak to how ecological footprint accounting can inform pathways to a carbon neutral economy. And so I'll start off then by explaining ecological footprint accounting. Ecological footprint accounting is a way of quantifying some of the important relationships between us and all of our stuff and the lands and waters around us and beneath us. Katie and I are ecological economists, and as such, we're joined by other ecological economists in being mindful that we cannot produce something from nothing, nor can we produce nothing from something. All the things that we produce in the name of economic production is actually transformation of materials and energy from the environment. And so with that in mind, we are attentive to the fact that all of us and all of our stuff is supported by resource inputs flowing from the lands and waters around us. And all of that generates waste outputs. A minimum condition to sustain this flow of resource inputs is to use them at rates that can be regenerated, and at the same time to emit waste outputs at rates that can be metabolized. At the same time, we need to optimize the space we occupy, considering trade-offs and pressures on biodiversity. Now, there are, of course, many trade-offs on the path to a carbon neutral economy, so it's important to account for these flows to understand how they've changed and how we ought to change them for a pathway to a carbon neutral economy. And that is what ecological footprint accounting does. Ecological footprint is a measure of humanity's demand for lands and waters that have the capacity to sustain our metabolism. This measure can be compared to biocapacity as a measure of the supply of that carrying capacity. Both are further detailed with the additive components of the demand for and the supply of fishing grounds, built-up land, cropland, grazing land, forest products, and forest carbon uptake. Forest biocapacity can supply forest products or forest carbon uptake. The planet's lands and waters have a limited amount of carrying capacity with respect to sequestering carbon emissions. And the conceptual framework of ecological footprint accounting allocates all terrestrial sequestration to forest lands after accounting for the ocean's rate of carbon sequestration. Of course, other parts of landscapes can sequester emissions as well, but forests have the highest rate of sequestration on an area basis around the planet. And so that's why we allocate it to forests to generate a measure of the minimum demand for lands to sequester emissions. All these components are additive, and they can all be measured in global hectares. The global hectare is a hectare of land or water that provides global average amount of capacity. And by measuring these in global hectares, that allows us to make comparisons anywhere across the planet at any moment in time, using a system of conversion factors that account for capacity relative to the global average. Now we can apply this framework to real world data, and that's what many of us at York University have done and have published online for the world to use. Here are results for 2017, revealing that the ecological footprint of humanity's consumption in that year was in excess of what could be sustainably supplied by biocapacity in that year. This data is for 2017, and this data can be situated along a timeline from 1961. This is a graph of the ratio of ecological footprint divided by biocapacity. We can see that humanity's ecological footprint has more than doubled in this time period. Since 1970, the world has been in global overshoot. So with the first Earth Day in 1970, the world has been demanding more from the planet that can be regenerated within that time span. And now at the same time, the world has also committed itself to a path towards a carbon neutral future by 2050, which essentially amounts to the world challenging itself to get this ratio down to 1 by then. Now, this is global data. That's the sum of national data. And so we can go into some details for what that looks like at various countries around the world at various moments in time. Here are some key metrics for Canada in 2017. Canada had about 750 million hectares of biocapacity, which can sustain one of the components of ecological footprint. These hectares provide the equivalent of about 550 million global hectares of biocapacity. Canada's lands and waters tend to provide carrying capacity less than the global average rate, and so that's why the hectares are deflated to get global hectares. Nevertheless, there's still a lot of global hectares within Canada's boundaries, so it's very important as to our stewardship of them on behalf of humanity and all of the planet. Of this biocapacity, about 78% was needed to sustain the ecological footprint of economic activities that took place in Canada in 2017. That's a lot. About 57% of this footprint was used to produce exports, which is disproportionately large considering Canada exports about 30% of domestic production. In 2017, more than twice as much biocapacity was used per dollar of Canadian exports than per dollar of Canadian imports. This difference was even larger in prior years. Canada effectively imports carrying capacity embedded or embodied within the goods and services that are imported into the country in a year. Now we could take the ecological footprint of production, and then from that, we can subtract the ecological footprint of exports, and then we can add the ecological footprint of imports to arrive at a measure of the ecological footprint of consumption in this time period. Now, this is the sort of high-level view of the key metrics for Canada in 2017. We can provide these for any country at any point on that timeline, of course. Now, these key metrics are derived from a much richer array of information that can be used to investigate product-specific details. Just on crops alone, for example, we have an inventory of several hundred crops from tables that have an excess of 16 million rows. And so this DDL data allows us to zero in on more specific environmental issues, which is what several students in the MES program and the faculty have done. So for example, understanding the global trade in shark fins, the emergence of a pineapple republic in Costa Rica, and the implications of the boom in Brazilian beef exports since 2000 are some of many data stories that students in the MES program had investigated using these accounts. And then beyond this rich array of big environmental data is a highly skilled team of people and of institutions that we at York have been leading. Of note, we created a Footprint Data Foundation, a not-for-profit organization incorporated here in Canada with the founding members of York and Global Footprint Network. That's supported by a science advisory committee with experts from around the world advising on the best ways to make further enhancements to these accounts. And all that is supported by a great team based in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change here at York University. Of note, as Alice said in the introduction, we benefit from an experiential education program within the Masters of Environmental Studies program. And so many of the key people producing the accounts that were provided to you in the previous slides and to the world through the open access data platform were employed as data analysts and have been trained up. And in the process as we speak, there's another cohort of MES students in training for summertime work. So back to the timeline then of ecological footprint relative to biocapacity. If we extend this out to the year 2050, it's important to think about the path of the next couple of decades and where we want to ultimately end up. Canada is one of 120 countries that have committed to reach the target of a net zero emissions by 2050. And what this means essentially on this graph is that Canada and the world has committed to get this ratio down to 1 by 2050. And so the obvious question here is over the next 30 years, how are we going to achieve that ratio that we haven't seen since 1970 when there were half as many people on the planet as there are today? So what is that pathway from here to there? That's where ecological footprint accounting can be tremendously useful. And so that's what I'd like to reflect on just very quickly. So the path to net zero emissions for Canada and indeed for the world involves many things. The path to net zero emissions involves evaluating nature-based solutions to climate change and biodiversity. You've probably heard about this expression, nature-based solutions. It's being used a lot in Canada and around the world. It's even made it to the mandate letters of several ministers, federal ministers of the environment and natural resources. Now, there's a suite of solutions in this realm. One of them is biofuels, such as ethanol as a substitute for fossil fuels. Now, Ontario is already doing this and is ramping up the proportion of ethanol required in gasoline sold in Ontario. Another option is afforestation of lands that were previously not forested. Another option is, for example, to use lands to supply renewable resources, such as timber, rather than non-renewable materials such as steel and aluminum and so on in construction. Now, there's even more options, of course, available than just these, but even amongst these three competing options, it's important to realize that all of these compete for the use of lands. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that these are all different ideas about how to use the land in order to reduce net emissions on the pathway to net zero by 2050. Our accounts are very useful for accounting for an area-based evaluation of trade-offs, which is so critical when people are talking about nature-based solutions, because we can't just sort of theorize about them in the abstract. We need to ground them in an area-based accounting to understand the trade-offs and the possibilities and the constraints with the extent to which some of these might compete for others and other uses of the lands and waters around us and beneath us. The path to net zero emissions also involves reconciling stimulus measures with environmental objectives. There's been a lot of talk about stimulus now, of course, given the COVID pandemic that we're still in at this moment. Just a few days ago, there was a federal budget release that had all sorts of stimulus measures within it. The budget identified that it plans to develop a climate lens to evaluate impacts, a sustainability lens, among other lenses and so on, that's going to help to evaluate stimulus measures and other things in the future. I would say, I don't think we need to overcomplicate this. I think this is much more within our reach than many people appreciate. And so I'd just like to reflect, of course, that every dollar of stimulus, when it's directed to a particular activity or an output or a particular kind of sector, will of course interact with the full supply chain within the economy and through exports and imports and so on, as exports and imports relate to sectors and activities and so on. Now, governments have typically been attentive to the impacts in terms of GDP or gross domestic product and jobs. But governments and society should also be able to see an estimate of the impacts on other environmental objectives as well. And that is so critical. One obvious environmental metric that would be very important to measure is ecological footprint as well related to this. Make it a ratio of GDP or jobs relative to the ecological footprint resulting from a particular type and amount of stimulus. There's your metric, there's your lens. This is the kind of stuff that's very helpful to help inform governments and society as they're trying to think of the path to net zero emissions and also think about economic sectors, jobs, GDP, and so on this year, today, and so on. And so with these kind of metrics, we can make comparisons to alternative ways of generating similar levels of output or alternative activities, alternative sectors to be prioritized to simulate or to downsize and so on. And so having metrics like this is really important. And our accounts of ecological footprint can generate green impact metrics to inform decisions. Now, the path to net zero emissions also involves providing pan-Canadian information to help provinces and the territories to manage resources and land use. It's important to keep in mind that constitutionally, the management of natural resources and land use is a provincial domain, and so that's why it's really important to be able to have information at a provincial level as well. And so that's one of the things that we've done actually in our initiative. We have generated provincial level accounts of biocapacity for Ontario in a consulting contract that we did within the last year for the government of Ontario. And we also generated an assessment of Ontario's ecological footprint of its consumption within certain time, within certain years, to inform Ontario's state of biodiversity, which is going to be reported on in the coming months. So stay tuned for that. Our accounts can be scaled subnationally and institutionally. We're also in the midst of working on a project to assess this related to York University's consumption and the consumption that happens on York's campus and also off campus in fulfillment of York's mission. So with all of that, I hope I've convinced you that ecological footprint accounting can inform pathways to a carbon neutral economy. Now, an obvious question in all of this is, why isn't this already happening? And so that relates to a very important part of our research that Katie will speak to now about the Canadian demand for ecological footprint metrics and so on. So I'll pass that over to her at this point.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you to everyone for coming here to hear more about the footprint and about how we can use the footprint to move to a carbon neutral economy. My name is Katie Kish. I'm a research associate with the Footprint Initiative. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the demand for the ecological footprint knowledge from Canadians to make policy related to reducing our carbon footprint. And so the real question I'm trying to answer here is, where does the public require our research go next? We just finished a knowledge synthesis grant. It was given to us by the SSHRC Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, where we did three main things. I'm going to look at numbers 2 and 3. Number 2 relates to the kind of knowledge available, and the second to the kind of knowledge needed about the footprint. To ascertain the kind of knowledge available, we did a literature review, and to figure out what Canadians need, we spoke to Canadians. So I'll present on these two, beginning with the literature review. Since 1992, when Bill Rees first wrote about the footprint, there's been a growth in new scholarly articles on the topic that continues to grow to this day. This plot is of the number of new scholarly articles about the ecological footprint or biocapacity published each year. This is from peer-reviewed English academic periodicals indexed by Scopus and filtered to remove any irrelevant matches. And to this day, the initial publication remains the most heavily cited with 13,000 citations. The accumulated scholarship about the topic has grown to an impressive volume of research, and with expected continued growth ahead. If we break this down by country of the article's corresponding authors, we can see some interesting trends. To date, scholars in China have contributed a lot of knowledge, surpassing scholars from the United States and the United Kingdom in 2012. Canada is in 5th place as the most common address of the corresponding author of the journal articles. We also investigated the purpose of the articles by coding them in rotating groups comprised of students and postdoc researchers and professors. The results show that published articles have been mainly focused on innovations of the concept, which amounts to around 2/3 of articles to date. And after that, the next most common purpose is the measurement of sustainability. And in 3rd place is the purpose of informing decisions or plans, which has grown over the last 10 years as data about the concept has become more widely available. This is good, as it means there's a bigger uptake in the implementation of the footprint, not just research. So it's being applied. Despite a lot of academic and international uptake, there has been less public uptake of the footprint in Canada. So we wanted to find out why and to develop a research agenda that would help address that gap. The last research agenda was published in 2009, and while it focused a lot on methodologies, it did end by saying that we need more on policy and public implementation. So it's consistent with the line of research of the footprint research over time. So to do this, I interviewed key sustainability decision makers and stakeholders across Canada, and we plan to do some additional focus groups. The people that we spoke to were from different levels of government, leaders of NGOs and think tanks, and the idea was to pull out and prime people to think about the ways they could use data like the ecological footprint in the work that they do. So I'm going to look at 2 major themes that emerged from those interviews that chart out where our attention needs to be on footprint work going forward. The first major area of feedback was around this need to move away from the notion of the abstract wild. While Canada has an identity as a country rich in natural spaces, this becomes a bit of a scapegoat for corporations and some governments. The positioning of nature as this vast wilderness also creates a separation between individuals and nature, which makes that abstraction more tolerable and corporate greenwashing more believable. So participants suggest that empirical and numerical stock of biocapacity, not monetarily driven though, would help shift away from historical efforts to create this abstract wild and to combat overuse. The participants argued that without such accounting systems over time, there could be a tendency to believe that Canada has these significant nature reserves, which we do. But if we're oriented in this way to always think that there's lots, then there'll be less worry about dipping into those stocks and a narrative that helps growth and consumption of natural spaces rather than conservation. Also, humans have a tendency to miscalculate and misunderstand values in stocks without clear empirical interpretations. So biocapacity accounting at the provincial level is needed in order to create informed decisions regarding biocapacity and the carbon footprint within the different provinces. The second major area of feedback that we received was for the footprint to incorporate local community needs. And a part of this was around cultural inclusion, which isn't really possible given what the footprint does. But you can pair it with different indicators, which gives you some interesting ideas there. At data.footprintfoundation.org, they've paired the footprint with the Human Development Index to try and do some of that comparison. But the footprint on its own can answer green community development needs. One person who I spoke with who has worked with the footprint for a very long time pointed out that despite being developed in Canada, there is still this enormous lack of uptake, unlike in Europe. And while the literature review demonstrates that Canadians are interested in and they use the footprint in their research, they're among the top academics writing about and using the footprint, municipalities and policymakers do not use it. This participant argued that this is because for the national level for countries in Europe, there isn't a large differentiation between national and major metropolitan areas because the countries are so small. But for Canada, there are massive provincial differentiations, let alone municipal. The differences between PEI and Alberta are enormous. And when you get down to the metropolitan level, Vancouver and Toronto, there's a totally different culture in both of those cities. But the participants that I spoke to in Vancouver, they were very interested to try out new things and new approaches to environmental governance, and were interested in being a guinea pig for the footprint. Whereas in Ontario, there was far greater skepticism and reservation, and they wanted to see it succeed elsewhere before they would implement it. But the interest is there at the municipalities because municipal government representatives say the majority of their tax money goes to infrastructure projects, and they need tools to be directly applicable to the tenure process to make good decisions. There's a need for disaggregated, granular level of data. They need to know what different kinds and amounts of concrete, for example, mean to their overall plans and how that fits into their climate emergency plans. The day-to-day is about infrastructure, it's about transportation, and the national level is far too removed to be useful for municipal policy development. But also, if this kind of granular data existed, it would be easier to compare the different kinds of cultures and approaches to environmental governance across Canada to make judgments about best practices for scaling up and to move towards a larger carbon neutral economy. A tool that could figure out municipal decisions of this kind would be a major success in bringing sustainability decision makers to Canadian communities. So the literature review gave us a really good picture of how the ecological footprint is used in academia. And the interviews gave us a really good idea about what municipal governments and stakeholders want and what policymakers need. So the next step to help municipalities and provinces move towards a carbon neutral policy is to develop a co-produced research agenda that will streamline available data to meet their identified needs. And so that we can bridge this divide between the academy and the public. The first part of that research agenda is to continue developing the accounts, collect the data, sanitize the data, and continue to make it free for everyone to use for whatever purposes they need. There was also some call for a look at what kinds of new indicators could be incorporated into the footprint that might indirectly, at least, incorporate culture, such as working hours. The second is around municipal policy development. There's a footprint group in British Columbia that's doing a lot of work here, and they need more capacity. While municipalities in Ontario would really like to do the work, but they're not sure where to start. So we need more of a united front. There's a ton of work to do here on developing, collecting, and modeling data to then turn it into policies for municipalities to learn from. So another major piece of this is to create a clear process and methodology streamlined for different municipalities so that we're not starting at zero when we begin to work with a city to become a one planet city. The third area is on developing provincial biocapacity. And the fourth is on the cross-scale dynamics across national, provincial, and municipal scales. This is mainly on how implementation of the footprint works at different levels and if it really leads to behavior change. This can already be done a little bit at the individual level because the footprint is used for educational purposes, particularly having people go to calculate their own ecological footprint. A lot of students will do that in school. So we can do a little bit of work there. But to look at the others regarding provincial or municipal or federal change, we need to dive into the other ones to be able to do that more completely. So the next step for us then is we're going to do focus groups with our stakeholders, with the community stakeholders and the public to formalize this research agenda and secure resources to start to put it into action. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you, Eric, for sharing with us the work that you do. It's both, scary and exciting to think that there's movement in the right direction. So thank you for being here with us, and Dean Havorka, thank you as well for being with us. I see you've all come back on camera, so now is the time for Q&A. So for our audience, if you have questions that you'd like to ask of any of our three members of our York University faculty community, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll ask them on your behalf. So perhaps I could start with the first question, which is, how did York end up leading the production of ecological footprint data that's so widely used?
Well, I can answer that. Several years ago, the organization called the Global Footprint Network was seeking academic partners from around the world to take on the various serious business of generating the data. The Global Footprint Network has developed a lot of aspects of the data over the years, and they've also engaged in very effective mobilization campaigns around the world. Some of the people on this call might have heard of Earth Overshoot Day, for example, is something that they've come up with, and they mobilize people around and so on. So anyways, yeah, at that time, a few years ago, they were looking for an academic partner to to join with to take on the production of the National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity accounts. And so a call for proposals went out and several universities competed, and York in its proposal was chosen by the Global Footprint Network ahead of others around the world. And so that's the genesis of this. And so since then, we've formalized our partnership arrangement. We've collectively built the Footprint Data Foundation, as I mentioned before. And the Footprint Data Foundation is governed by a board of directors, drawing on great skills and capacities and so on across policy, data, government, private sector, and so on. And it's that organization that's sort of the keeper of the accounts and so on. And then York, of course, is a key part of all that. So yeah, that's the genesis of this. And then through this, we're also engaging in new partnerships and collaborations around the world. And so that's it's very exciting to be reaching out to people around the world at other great universities that are partnering with us.
Thank you. The next question that's coming in is, what is the implication of calculating ecological footprint in administrative boundary, especially in relation to leakage of EF?
Well, I could jump in first, maybe, and then Katie can go in after that. So in terms of the leakage that was referred to there, I assume that's referring to, for example, for a city, imagine Toronto or any other city, it's got a lot of consumption within the boundaries of that city, consumption that is sourced from materials and services and so on beyond the boundaries of that city. And so one of the great things with these accounts is that we make distinctions between the footprint of consumption and the footprint of production that takes place within certain boundaries. And as mentioned, of course, this grounds all of our metabolism to lands and waters that exist on the planet. And so I think that this approach can be very helpful, as Katie mentioned, at a municipal level or even at an institutional level, such as York University. Obviously, York University is a sort of a nexus of education, research, scholarship, engagement, impact, and all that sort of stuff. A lot of things happen on campus that are supported by, of course, lands and waters way beyond the campus. So this allows us to quantify that and make that distinction. And that's really important, especially, let's say, at the level of a city or a region or a province and so on. If it's strategizing about how to achieve certain metrics of sustainability, it ought to be attentive to the potential that a lot of what it decides to do or not do is going to maybe affect what goes on within its boundaries, but potentially not as much of what goes on outside of the rest, outside of its boundaries too. So it needs to be attentive to that. And I'll just say, even if we scale up to the national level, over the years, some nations have reduced the emissions within their boundaries corresponding to all the stuff that they produce in the course of a year, but it's been substituted by emissions happening overseas or outside of the boundaries that are embodied within the products that are imported into the country that are no longer produced in the country. And so that's why when we're accounting for things like emissions, we're accounting for things like impacts on biodiversity and so on, we need to be accounting for them not just within the boundary, but also beyond the boundary, and attentive to the potential that, as the questioner was asking about leakage, I would say about I would sort of reframe it a bit as to the extent to which there are those relations to trade and flows beyond the boundaries of the analysis.
Yeah, and I'll just also say that I mean, as a tool, it can help the local administrative body better understand the state of biocapacity in their region. So then you can make better policy to support that going in a direction that you would prefer, or that the city would prefer. So the footprint and biocapacity is used in sustainability plans for some European countries and cities. I think it's like 30 different countries. I'd have to check the number. It's in the report that we just published, how many cities have adopted that. And so it's part of their plan now. So talking to the policymakers in Canada within different administrative areas, they need data, they need graphs that are nice looking and compelling to bring to council. that not only to show that it will meet the climate emergency plans that a lot of the municipalities have implemented, but that it'll also help them save money in the long term, comparing it against these monetary metrics. So they need this graphical data also to help citizens show that their decisions are impactful and meaningful, to show that they are a part of the administrative body's movement toward what the Footprint Network calls a one planet city, everybody only having a footprint for just one planet. And so these kinds of tools can demonstrate that where and what you buy and consume has a direct impact on the footprint of that administrative region.
Thank you for that. And I think it leads really nicely to the next question, which is a question that came in from Teti asking, which app can my company use to calculate our yearly global ecological footprint and measure changes over time?
Well, I don't think there's a single app that your company can load up, but I think there are several private sector companies that have made it their business to help with things like footprint auditing and things like that. I think it's a bit more intensive than just having sort of an app, but presumably though, the company could create an app derived from that information. So the possibilities are endless. There are many examples that the Footprint Network has profiled on its site called footprintnetwork.org of businesses that have engaged with this, some in the financial sector, other in the more industrial areas and so on. And so I'd encourage the person who asked that to check that out. And yeah, be inspired by those who have engaged with that. And then also to realize that there's a tremendous, I would say, leadership potential, almost like early mover potential, early adopter potential too, because it's still not widespread in terms of with across the corporate sector, but it still is sort of will put you at the leading edge of things, I think. So that's what I would suggest there. But there are other apps that have been developed though that relate to more, let's say, personal level decisions and trade-offs and so on. And there is also an interesting app that's being developed by the team that Katie was talking about out west that is helping anchor this to the municipal level and so on. I forget the name exactly right now of the app in development, but they had a webinar I think a few weeks ago profiling their work in progress. So anyways, we can always follow up some more if someone's looking for email addresses and contact names of who to get in touch with. Happy to provide that afterwards.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to read the next question that's coming in from William. It's a little bit long, but it's a really great question, so bear with me. What possibilities do you see for bringing in the work of EUC's Ecological Footprint Initiative into the undergraduate classroom? And they give the example, in world geography, we've included an activity in which students calculate their own EF for many years, but this sometimes generates more focus on individual guilt rather than societal change. Are there practical exercises for undergrad, especially first-year students, that we can develop to help students understand the scale of the societal and policy as you focused on today?
Katie, I'll jump in first, maybe, if that's all right. Yeah, lots of potential there. And as I mentioned before, we've had students in the master's program help build the accounts, but this is not something that necessarily requires only master's level education. This is something that I think would be of tremendous interest to those in undergraduate programs and even in high school students as well. The way that we approach the pedagogy, I think, is one of tapping into people's innate interest in discovery. And what we do is we provide people with a spreadsheet of all the interesting nitty-gritty details that go into the production of the accounts for just one country in 1 year. And And so for whatever country of interest to anyone in whatever year, we could supply that data. And then within just a few minutes, and I've done this in the classroom, within just a few minutes, people are all of a sudden coming across interesting aspects of whether it's a particular thing that's consumed, whether it's a particular relation of emissions relating to, let's say, ships and bunker fuel and so on that's used to transport things around the world and so on, to, for example, the emissions embodied within electricity and so on. That quickly becomes apparent as to some of those things are within the realm of individuals and households to make decisions and trade-offs on, but many of them others are societal. And so that's where it's our engagement with public policy that makes a difference. It's our engagement with supply chains and metrics and data and so on. And anyways, it's a great launching point for that. And so I think, yeah, there's a tremendous potential across all realms. I don't mean to imply that one needs a very high level of formal education or attainment in order to engage with this. It's our role, our task, our challenge as educators to make it as exciting as possible for anyone, regardless. Yeah, right on.
Yeah, I'll give a two-part answer. The first is that, so I use the footprint tool with my students as well in a very similar way. I do get them to calculate their own footprint, but then I ask them, what happens if you scale it up? If you had to make changes to make your footprint into a one planet footprint, what changes would those be? What if everyone in your city had to make those changes? What if everybody in your country had to make those changes? What would that look like? What kind of impacts would that have with other cities in Canada? If it was federal, what does that do with trade relationships and getting them to think more? Because getting them to think at the individual level is just helping to orient the information at a scale that makes sense to people on an individual level. So then you can scale it up. And I mean, more than that, like getting students to think about that every little change in these cities, if there's more cities doing that and lots of people doing it, then we're creating this collective force that will eventually take hold. And so there is hope in doing small steps. Wouldn't want them to get discouraged regarding that.
And actually, if I could just add in another very specific example close to many of us on this call. So we've assessed the ecological footprint of consumption activities that took place in Ontario over the years from 2005 to 2015. Over that time period, there was a dramatic change that happened in Ontario, and that was that we heavily decarbonized the electricity system. In 2005, about 20% of all the electricity generated in Ontario was generated by burning coal, which is the most carbon intensive way to generate electricity as compared to other elements of supply that exist then and that exist now. And so that's something interesting to reflect on. That actually allowed Ontario's ecological footprint of consumption to decline over that time period, even though there were more people in Ontario consuming more things in that time period. And so that's something interesting to reflect on, because that was not something that was an individual decision, even though there can be individual decisions around, for example, buying bullfrog power, which is essentially a payment to a company to offset the carbon or the non-renewables that are in Ontario's electricity mix. But it's, that's a good sort of teaching point to reflect on just that sort of systemic change that required sort of the collective will to do something about that. That was beyond the sort of individual micro level decisions of trade-offs between, a basket of options and so on.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we're out of time for additional questions. Are there any remarks or thoughts that anyone wanted to share before we thank you and say goodbye to our panelists? Alice, please go ahead.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you so much, Katie and Eric. Every time I'm part of a conversation that involves the Ecological Footprint Initiative, I am really inspired, and I have to say I'm loving the questions that are asking from corporations or industry, how can we measure our footprint, or learning that our first-year geography course is offering a footprint calculator moment for our undergraduate students, and that undergraduate students are interested in learning more. I encourage everyone to go to the website website to check out, which has been put in the chat, to check out more about this really exciting living lab at our new faculty. And I really want to thank Katie and Eric for all their efforts in really helping bring this tool to life. And I love this idea of data stories that we need now. We need data stories that are informing decisions that are going to balance people, profit, and planet. We really need this kind of information now, and we need this to inform decisions. So thank you so much.
Yes, I want to certainly echo my thanks to Katie and Eric for being here and sharing your research, and to you, Jean Havorka, for being here with us and for leading this wonderful faculty and the incredible work that we're doing to make the world and the planet a better place. So at this point, I will invite you to turn off your cameras, and we thank you all and wish you well. And I'll just conclude with some final remarks. Okay, for our audience that's here, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your questions. We have one last poll question for you that will pop up. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge of the topic of today's presentation following the insightful discussion we've just had? So I'll give you a moment just to answer the poll. I know for me, it's certainly improved my understanding from being here over this past little while. Okay. So just in terms of what we have next, we have a lot of great lectures in store for you this spring. So please check out the Alumni and Friends website for details. Just to give you a bit of a sneak preview, on Wednesday, April 28th at 11, join us for Building Strong and Resilient Health Systems in Ghana, a unique partnership between York University and the University of Health and Allied Sciences in Ghana. And once again, on April 30th at noon, all are welcome to the York U of the Future, which is a conversation with our president, Rhonda Lenton. On Wednesday, May 5th at noon, join us for COVIDeo Speculations on the Future of Live Performance, featuring Dr. Sarah Bei Cheng, who's the Dean in our Faculty of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design. For more information about the Scholars Hub at Home series, as well as all of our other virtual events, please visit our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Feel free to share today's talk and all of our Scholars Hub at Home events with your friends. It will be posted on our York Alumni YouTube channel shortly. So I thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for caring about our planet, and I wish you well.